Uh, Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. A little technical difficulty in getting the Zoom to work, but thank you for joining us for the fourth and final session for the Entrepreneurial Education Series, Best Practices in Recruiting and Running Your Startup Boards. I'm Jeremy Garvey. I'm the Office Managing Partner at Cozen O'Connor in Pittsburgh. I'll be serving as the moderator today, and we're very fortunate to have a great panel for you, both from the investor standpoint and also from the entrepreneur standpoint. I want to pause and give a special thanks to Rich Lunak at Innovation Works. Rich was instrumental in trying to put this together, did a lot of the heavy lifting, and was gracious enough to get our panelists. So thank you to Rich. Also, for those joining today, as you know, this series was created out of our flagship event, the Three River Venture Fair. It takes place every 12 to 18 months. Between sessions, we do things like we did yesterday and today, trying to give entrepreneurs useful tools. Before I get started, obviously the symposium would not go off without our sponsors. Thank you to all of those folks who have sponsored this and the fair. In addition to backstopping the symposium, these are all Three River Venture Fair sponsors. If you have any interest and would like to be a sponsor, please contact Micah Whitfield. She is the Director of Business Development at the PVCA. And it's my pleasure now to introduce our two panelists. I'm going to ask both of them to do a quick introduction of themselves. First, Donna Myers, who is the CEO of Salsa Labs and a serial entrepreneur, and John McIlwraith of Allos Ventures. John has been in venture and early stage in the venture and early stage game for a very long time. Donna, I'll kick it over to you for a quick introduction, and then over to John, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'll make this short. I've been involved in managing, directing, and raising funds for lots of startups, from pharmaceutical contract research organizations to healthcare IT to technology in the nonprofit sector. So I'm currently the CEO of Salsa Labs, and our company is backed by the technology-focused private equity firm, Excel KKR. I've led boards for companies backed exclusively by angel investors, those with majority VC ownership, and now private equity owned.
Great, and I'm John McIlwraith, co-founder and managing director of Allos Ventures, as Jeremy mentioned. And we're an early stage and seed stage focused venture fund based in Cincinnati and Indianapolis. We make seed investments of about $200,000 in what are typically $1 million or so rounds. So we make early stage investments, Series A investments, about $2 million in what are typically $4 to $6, $7 million Series A financings. Very active in the Midwest. We've invested in over 30 companies since we founded the firm back in 2010. Actually have 3 investments currently in Pittsburgh in Maven Machines, Rimsys, and Glasspoint. So we're excited to be participating in the Pittsburgh ecosystem. I started my career as a lawyer at Jones Day, representing venture funds and venture-backed companies, much like Jeremy. And then I decided I needed to get some operating experience before I ventured into the venture capital world. So I worked for a publicly traded but venture-backed healthcare services company called Quantum Health Resources, in a strategy role and a general counsel role. And then I entered the venture capital world back in '97 with Blue Chip. Probably served on over 50 boards over that time period, in many cases as a chairman of a board. So a lot of experience in building boards and seeing boards that are effective and are not. And I'm currently on the board of a publicly traded company, Meridian Bioscience. So I get to see what happens when companies go public and have to transition the board to a public setting. So I'm delighted to be on the panel today and look forward to the discussion.
Donna and John, thanks. Let's get right to it. So I think there's a lot to cover, but I think we were going to focus mostly on the who and the what. And we're really talking about strategies for obtaining board members and really effective board members. So I guess, Don, I'll kick it to you. from an entrepreneur standpoint, what are some of the approaches, and what is your experience borne out as it relates to trying to attract board members, and what is important in your view in trying to get those folks to serve?
So in terms of board members, three things are important for me in a board member: diversity, expertise, and knowledge. So I look for experts in subject matters that are critical or challenging for the company. So for example, so early on at Salsa, our biggest challenge was in lead generation. So it made sense that our VC rep was actually their chief marketing officer. So she was able to help us think through our lead generation strategy. You also want folks that have been in your shoes and have succeeded. Those who understand what it's like to be cash strapped, understand resource constrained, folks that have really harnessed that entrepreneurial energy and created something great. And then in terms of expertise, I'm speaking specifically of domain expertise. I think you want someone from and who really understands the sector or the industry that you want to serve, the voice of the customer, somebody coming from the customer perspective. So to give you a couple examples, at Apache Medical Systems, where we made decision support software for ICUs, we had the head of critical care medicine from Adventist Health on the board. For TechRx, where we made pharmacy software, we had the dean of pharmacy at Pitt. At DonorPro, where we made fundraising software for nonprofits, we had the CEO of the Pittsburgh History and Landmark Foundation.
Great. John, from your perspective, probably supporting the entrepreneur, but what do you see as important, and how do you view sort of the attraction and retention of board members?
Sure, I agree with much of what Donna said. At a high level, I guess, and this is to state the obvious, but I think it's still worth stating, a properly structured board can be an incredibly high value resource for a founder. You can't overstate that. Startup and early stage founders, and well beyond the governance role. One thing to think about, seats are very precious, and we'll talk a little bit more probably about how you fill those seats, but every seat on that board is precious. And if you fill it prematurely with somebody who's not going to be a long-term value add to your company, that's going to create problems for you as the founder, because you're going to have to at some point ask that person to leave the board likely. And also becomes a bit of a negative when VCs and others start to look at your company and think about all the things they might have to change. If they've got to make major changes in your board, that's going to have an impact. It's going to create some unnecessary friction. So be very mindful of that. Find people who can advise you early on about how to fill those seats, and you don't need to rush to fill them before you start raising capital from either the angel investors or VCs. And I'd watch family members having too many angel reps. I mean, most angels like to be on boards. That's part of why they are angel investors. I think you got to watch having too many of those. There's retired executives that love to serve on boards. And to Donna's point, if they're not a subject matter expert with some expertise that doesn't have a short half-life, meaning you won't burn through their networks or their contacts list quickly and then wonder why they're on your board, I'd stay away from them and really look for a board member that's a great fit. And one thing to think about for a lot of companies, and Jeremy or Donna, you may have a different view, at the seed stage, you might have a 3-person board. Yourself as the founder, if you've got a co-founder, okay, maybe there's 2, and that might drive you to a 5-person board, but usually it's a 3 to 5-person board. And in our minds, there always should be at least one independent director. So if it's a 5-person board, it's probably a founder, a CEO, and maybe a representative of the early investors. There's probably a VC, maybe 2, depending upon how you've raised your capital. And then there's an independent. So you've got to think about it. While the VCs can bring value, and Donna, it's great that you had a VC that was able to bring some marketing experience to the board. you really have that. Usually there's one seat for that independent that really is the person that's going to bring some strong value to your board. And as Donna said, finding people with connections in the industry. For example, at Maven, when we were looking at investing in Maven, we were very impressed to see that Ivan Hoffman, who was the founder of what became FedEx Ground in the trucking industry, Maven's in the trucking industry, a trucking software company. He was on the board. Incredible resource. I mean, he's a dean of the trucking industry and has been a wonderful asset. And he was already on the board because Avi, the founder, was smart about filling those seats early on. Similarly, at Rimsys, which is another company we've invested in, regulatory information management software, one of the biggest needs was going to be, well, two needs: marketing, how to go to market. It was a very early stage company, but also somebody who could be a real coach to the CEO, who was a first-time founder. And we were able to land Eric Bodak, who's a Pittsburgh native, who's now senior management at Pendo, a very large, successful software company. He's our board member. We have a 3-person board, and he is the independent director. Incredibly helpful in recruiting people, giving James, the founder, coaching, serving in a governance role. So, those are the sorts of things we think about as we're trying to build or help our entrepreneurs, help our founders build boards.
John, that's terrific. I look, we're going to talk a little bit later about cadence and sequencing, but I do think, finding particularly in the earliest companies, finding the right sort of fit, to have the right number, and also, to have the right sequencing, because we either see no boards, right? No governance whatsoever, or every time you turn around, you're having a board meeting. And I think it's trying to find the right balance, and obviously get that discipline for the company is important. Maybe to get a little bit more granular, this is always a hard question. We kind of honed in on sort of the expertise. Obviously, diversity and inclusion is super important. Always has been. Is more important today. But Donna, when it comes to trying to recruit, I mean, actually, the nitty gritty of how do you do this? It's probably like a whole lot of what entrepreneurs do. It's we just do it. But what advice and what strategies can you give folks to say, I want to go out and I want to see if I can get one of those value added board members?
Sure. So there's no question that warm introductions are the best. So my advice would be to put your wish list together, the types of skills, the particular backgrounds, even specific individuals that you might want. And then socialize that with your funders. Idea Foundry and Innovation Works were very helpful to me. And, funders know lots of people who know lots of people. And, also depending upon where you are in your career, you can reach out to professors, to colleagues, even clients, alpha, beta clients that you've got can help you with recruiting. And then if warm introductions just aren't there, then it's research and tenacity. Going online, identifying targets, and then using vehicles like LinkedIn to connect.
And I think that's really good advice. I mean, trying to get folks who can connect you to those folks is always important. John, you're probably the major connector, right? If you come in, you're the person who can find the conduit probably almost anywhere when you all either make an investment or have had the introduction. What do you see, and what has your experience been in trying to get those folks to try to come onto early stage boards or growth company boards?
Yeah, we everything Donna said, I concur. Our fund, Allos, is mostly made up of successful entrepreneurs and executives, and we leverage them and benefit from their experience, not just in the companies they've built, but the networks they've created and like. So if we're going to make an ed tech investment, we have several executives that were very successful in the ed tech space, and in addition to them helping us do due diligence, like we leverage that to say, hey, we need to find a board member. Can you tee up some candidates? Can you point us in the right direction? There are a lot of resources. Donna mentioned them. LinkedIn's a wonderful resource these days, but it's usually a warm introduction. It's a connection someplace. But one thing I caution, that we see some companies go the search firm route, and there are search firms that are very good at finding board members, particularly for public companies. I think that works less well in the startup and early stages. You might find a board member, but their expectations, their fit, their, not so much their experience base and maybe their networks, but their ability to really relate to a startup early stage company can be a challenge. So I think you're better off leveraging your financial partners, your financing investors, and leveraging, as Donna said, some of the networks in your community, whether it's through the universities, the entrepreneurship programs, and the like. And I said it earlier, you've got to watch the early, and Jeremy, you said some of the companies you work with don't even have boards. I'm sure you've seen some that have put together a board too soon, and maybe the founder wasn't able to resist the desires of folks to get on that board. Just one story that can tell you about what the friction can do. We had a great technology company in Kentucky we were looking at, loved the founder, wonderful multiple time founder. In the course of raising money from angels, which is how everybody typically has to start, she had 4 individual reps on her board representing either their own money or their angel group. So 4 different financial investor reps and herself. We found the company engaged. We wrote a term sheet, and we basically said, hey, you guys all add value, but we do too, and let's go find some independent directors. So let's reset the board. And I think we were suggesting a 5-person board, and one of that group would stay on, founder would stay on, and we would have a board seat, and maybe there was another co-founder, but we said, let's go find the world's perfect independent director, but let's get this board down to a manageable level. And I think we're going to talk a little later about the appropriate size. And those investors resisted and said no. Wow. And as a result, the financing didn't go forward. Yeah. And the company failed. I mean, it could not. I mean, she had been out raising money for a while, and she finally got a term sheet. And I saw her a couple of years later, and she could just see. I mean, she had a great company, but that friction and frankly the unwillingness of those folks to depart, I mentioned earlier, basically stopped the process. So it's, I tell that as just it's I said it earlier. You got to be very careful, because venture capitalists and investors, anything they see as friction or something that takes away from the hard work in building a business causes them to typically shy away. And so anyway, enough said on that point.
Hey, John, in a situation like that, maybe what she should have done was try to get some of those early angel investors to maybe be a board observer, so they could still be there in the boardroom and hear what's going on, but not a member of the board of directors.
Yeah, and she tried. I mean, and that's what we try and do. And I think our term sheet probably even said that. Yeah. But these were just angel investors who, for them, the fun was not so much, it was making that investment and having the upside, but it was being part of this exciting tech company, and they wanted to have a seat at the table. So it's definitely something worth watching. And the other thing that, again, goes without saying, but it's not always done. Once you get it down to a short list, do references, and do references off the reference list. I mean, just because they've got a strong resume and a strong experience base, and they came in through a warm lead, you want to find out, particularly if they've been a board member in other companies, how are they as a board member? I mean, they might have been a great executive. They may not make such a great board member. And you want to make sure they're going to be collaborative and helpful versus, being sort of the opposite of that.
Yeah. I think a couple of very good points. I mean, John, to your point that make the easy things easy. I think it makes, angel investors and particularly institutional investors very nervous if you have board members who are, it's more important that they be a board member than you advance the cause. I think that's a huge red flag. To sort of skill sets, what I've seen, and again, when you're early on, I think a small board with, with an independent is helpful. I think as your board grows, I think if you matrix out sort of the skill sets that you think are important, I've often, spending as much time, as John knows in his earlier life, and Donna has been in a number of boardrooms, a board takes on sort of a life of its own. I've often wanted to write a book, The Subculture of Boards. And each of those, becomes sort of a unit, and they have a working, but it's different than working with somebody every day. And so I think that cultural impact is important. But when you look at the skill sets, you don't want, 5 CFOs or former CFOs, and you need, depending on what the domain expertise is, you need the right mix, and you need the right parts to make it work. So I think also looking at the relative skill sets and maybe matrixing those out. I also think it's important. I've seen some very, very good board members, right? A board is a board, but you're serving on a big public company board, or being in a big company doesn't always translate necessarily to an early stage company. The resources are different. The way that you approach problems are different. Your risk tolerance are different. The ability of using, resources to solve issues are different. So I think the reference check is an important one. And I think you need to think about sort of your mission as an early stage company and how you move that forward, and not just the resume and is this going to make us look better? Because there are hard questions that come to the board, and there are things that in companies like this that you face that you don't face in other companies. Maybe to leverage off of that, I mean, John, you gave some examples of some areas of in the term sheet stage, but what other things have you seen that are either good as it relates to trying to attract folks, or mistakes or missteps? I mean, oftentimes, you're the folks who come in and say, we need to reshape the board, which is pretty typical sometimes. And, that's always easier done around a fundraising than it is just sort of, agnostically. That's friction that is hard. I think I once said it's really darn hard to get a good board member, but it's even harder sometimes to get rid of them if they don't want to go. And that's true. I mean, and there's various reasons for that. But what have you seen? What war stories can you share? What are the things that have gone, wrong, or what's gone really right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I said it earlier. And it's we actually are used often by founders, particularly founders they're on their second or third company, to help clean up the boards. I think they had good intentions, and they had a pretty good playbook when they created their board, and then they realized they had a board member or two that weren't working out. Sometimes they're from prior investors. And so they've used our process and our term sheet to try and clean up their board. Now, we probably would have gotten there anyway, but that's one of the things they start talking with us about early on, which is sort of interesting. It gets back to references. And the only other war story, we had a fairly far along, still early stage company, but not yet public, but I headed down that path, and we needed to replace our audit chair. We had a full audit committee and audit chair. And so we did a search. We utilized friends. We had a great contact. We had actually our ideal candidate said, I'm just too busy. I've got too many boards. I've started my own company again. But I've got a great candidate who I used to use, my co-founder of one of my companies, perfect for audit, perfect for administrative stuff, great compliment to the rest of your board. We said, terrific. I introduced it to the company, and then unfortunately the company didn't do enough reference checks, and nobody was really paying attention. That was partly my fault, but I think I went on vacation or something like that after making the introduction, and they asked him to be on the board. And within a month, he was not a very collaborative board member generally, but what he would do, which was worse, is in between board meetings, he'd reach out to the CEO and want a separate debrief and want to engage in full-blown conversations about topics that were of interest to him, but not particularly helpful to the company. And we went through about 2 or 3 quarters of that. And basically, and I got the job, since I was on vacation originally, of helping him off the board. It was remarkable. And it all came down to reference checks. I think if anybody had done a reference check rather than just relying on his co-founder, who was well-intended when he made the referral, I think we would have found out about it, because it was pretty clear once he started in that first meeting, it was probably not going to be a good fit. So again, I've already said it, but we can't overstate it, man. You gotta work those references and triangulate. Don't rely on the ones that person gives you. Try and figure out from the community or others, what's the person really like on the board? What's the value they really bring? And are they collaborative? So anyway, some of that's redundant, but hopefully it's helpful.
And Donna, just to build off of what John said, I mean, obviously it's you wear many hats, as sort of the central figure running a company, and having a board member and having them give good advice is always helpful, but getting the most out of them, getting them engaged, getting them excited, getting the most mileage you can. What is your thoughts, or what are your thoughts on doing that in ways to keep them interested, in to make sure that they're up to speed and that they're providing you value?
Sure. So the first thing that I do is I make sure that new board member is immersed in the company, and I do that by holding an orientation session, just like I would with a new employee, where I'm educating them on the industry that we're serving in, who our competitors are, what our secret sauce is, tell them about the operations, the management team, if appropriate, have them sit in on a demo of the product. In my case, it's always been a software company, so I actually have them sit in on a software demo to a prospect, and I actually have them talk to a client or two. So some of our client references I have them speak to, so they really get to understand the business. And then once they're on the board, things that I do to ensure that they're engaged, I make sure that I send the board deck out at least a few days ahead, if not a week ahead of the board meeting. So it gives the board members a chance to review and prepare their thoughts. There's nothing worse than the CEOs, I think, that send their board deck out like at 10 o'clock the night before a board meeting that's to start 9 o'clock the next morning. So you literally have your board members coming in, reading the board deck with you as you go through, and that's not productive for anybody. And we're going to talk about cadence, but I usually do quarterly board meetings, but in addition to the quarterly board meetings, I do at least a monthly check-in with each board member. So nothing formal, not a formal board call, but just a friendly call to check in, or lunch or coffee when that's allowed again in our post-COVID world. And then during those calls, just talk about some of the successes the company's had, and I use them as a sounding board for some issues I might be struggling with, just to have a conversation about how the business is going.
That's great.
Donna,
go ahead, John. Sorry.
Donna, you made a great point, and materials in advance, 3 to 5 days in advance for sure. And one of our best practices, we actually developed a deck that we share with founders when we make an investment that has a series of best practices from building your board meetings, the whole range. But the other thing that and I'll see whether you agree with this, Donna, you don't want board members showing up, even if you gave it to them 3 days in advance, and asking questions that the deck clearly answered. And so the way we approach it is the deck is really just a guide for the meeting. And we encourage our CEOs and the management team members who present to talk about the aspects of any given slide, what's really important, what's maybe behind the slide, but don't read the slides, whether they're financial slides or operating slides or whatever. And assume that board members have read the materials. And if they haven't, and this, I'll go sideways for a moment, we always encourage companies to separate the CEO and the chair role, and to find a strong chair. Because if you find that your board, particularly as you get up to a 7-person board, or maybe you have observers, that chair could run interference for the CEO on things like, hey, if a board member hasn't prepared, the chair may not allow the CEO to entertain the questions that are going to take everybody's time, helping them get up to speed on something they should have read in advance. And so, and I agree, I think you said it, send the deck out, ask them to send in their questions and address their questions in addition to hitting the highlights that the team thinks is important. But don't spend the 2 or 3 hours or longer just basically going rote through the deck. That's not a good practice.
Yeah, 100% agree with that.
Yeah, that's terrific advice. I think And we've got a couple of questions, and one of them, John, remind me, don't let me forget, but there's some folks who've asked if you could share that deck, but we'll get to the questions.
Yeah.
As it sort of relates to, the constituencies that you find in the boardroom. Donna, you alluded to sort of maybe observers, and other folks, but the cast of characters that you generally get in a boardroom. You've got founders and management, you've got investors. Sometimes you have a chairman or a lead director. And the distinction there is a lead director is not necessarily a chairman, but it's a function of who's going to drive the board process. If there's an independent discussion that needs to happen outside of management, you've got independent directors, and you've got sort of sometimes you have counsel or hopefully you've got somebody taking down the minutes. We could probably talk about what should and should not go in those minutes for some period of time. And then you've got sort of observers. You've got this, Donna, this gaggle of people that show up, and they're all sort of yours to manage. What are your thoughts around sort of those folks and what you've experienced and what you've seen work well? What's customary for your board meetings that you've had, and how do you deal with all those folks who probably have slightly different angles as they come into the company and what they're trying to get out of it?
Sure. Oh, okay. So there's a lot to share here, but one of the things that I do want to talk about is, some entrepreneurs look at boards as it's us against them. It's founders and management versus the funders. And they try to stack their board with founders because they're worried about controlling the vote. And to me, that's not healthy. You work with your founders every day. You already have their wisdom, and here's a chance for you to get help and guidance from other seasoned professionals. So I just wanted to make that point. And then, I don't know that I treat my board members differently based on the group that they represent. They all have access to the same information. But, if I had a lot of board observers in one company, I had as many board observers as I did board members. And it was one of those situations, as John had mentioned earlier, where early on, I was funded by angels and I had, a board full of angel investors, and they didn't like being kicked off. So they took observer roles. But anyway, if you do have a lot of board observers, I'd be sure to get some rules in place in advance. Do you want them to participate in board discussions? They obviously don't vote, but, if you want, you could ask them to be silent observers unless called upon. In the case of like maybe a bank that you have a loan from is a board observer. Do you really want them participating in discussions about how to run your company?
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes you get a lot of those observers, and there's a lot less observation, and there's a whole lot more discussion. And it's not that that's necessarily horrible, but when you a lot of times when you're asking folks to come in and be your sort of outside independent board member, they're the folks that you generally most want have limited time. And so to have a board meeting that doesn't function well, and particularly when you think about, why you're all there, it's for management really to update the board, allow them to exercise whatever legal responsibilities and fiduciary duties they have. But also, what I would say is the best boards are, and some of them are pretty pretty lean operations, it's where they do get, pretty concise information packages out early enough for people to look at them. And then it's a discussion about what are the, how are things going? What can we do? Where are the, and I think it's, it may be obvious, it's a collection of smart people with different experiences who don't have the same stresses that management have, that, maybe have a different view. And I think that's the best way to kind of get the most out of your board is, you give them the information. Obviously they have to exercise the duties that they have to exercise, but they come in and they give management advice. And management, filters that advice and decides what to do with it. And so I think that's in my experience, what works well. John, you're one of those stakeholders generally, and from your standpoint, Allos is in the business of making the entrepreneur successful. So it's not like you're coming in to make life difficult. I probably say it's just the opposite. You're trying to reduce friction and find a way to make the world easier. What's your view of sort of the typical setup and in the stakeholders that are there, and how you look at them and how things should function vis-a-vis all those folks?
Sure. And you've got the list here. And by the way, and Donna, you said it, and Jeremy, it was in your comments. Founders and CEOs should view a lot of them go into these board meetings viewing the board as evil or a waste of time. Right? I had one that said, I don't want any questions. I want to get in and out as fast as I can. And that's just, if you think that way, you have a bad board, because the board should add a lot of value and you should leverage the heck out of it if you set the right board. On these topics, in terms of the meeting itself, something that isn't talked about much, we don't recommend team members being in the board meeting the entire time. It stifles conversation. Sometimes there'll be something will come up. There'll be a comment that without the right amount of context, a mid-level team member who was there to present something might take it the wrong way, and then it spreads like wildfire through your company, and you have to put out the fires. And so, we typically, the structure we like best, and it's in our deck, is you start the meeting with the CEO with an executive session with the outside board members. And that's really to set the stage for the meeting, talk about any sensitivities, let the board know what's going to happen. The board can say, here's some things we really like to hear about. And then you bring in whatever team members you have presenting for their section. And the exception might be part of the truly senior team. So that might be the COO or the CFO. They may be there the whole meeting other than executive session, but head of sales, head of marketing, and the like, typically they come in, they do their thing, or maybe they do it as a group and then they leave. So that's one recommendation. It's not all the time, but that seems to work best. And it's important not to stifle conversation. I'll get to that in a moment when it comes to observers. We also recommend there be an executive session at the end of the board meeting with the CEO. So how the meeting go, what came out of it, what should we be focused on, how can we be helpful? And then we have a standing executive session without the CEO on every agenda. And that's sometimes there's nothing discussed, but rather than have some board members say, I think we should have an executive session without the CEO, which usually will freak the CEO out. You just have it on the agenda and it just happens. And you don't have to worry about whether the CEO is wondering what's going to be talked about. They still wonder, but at least it's not being catalyzed or something. So that's how we think board meetings should run in terms of the stages and who's in there. The other thing on observers, and it's a challenge because, as Donna said, sometimes you have to offer the observer sheet to get the term sheet done and get the financing done and start to move people off your board. But man, if you have too many observers, and we've seen this, we had one, and Jeremy, I think you know this company, it's from a while back. I think we had 4 or 5 observers in addition to 5 or 6 board members. It was a huge group, and nobody talked because they were a little shy and they had some good things to talk about, but they wouldn't, or they didn't want to talk about sensitive topics in front of a large group that included many observers, and it just stifles conversation. So if you have to have observers, and sometimes you do, you have to, but that's just like this. Board sheets are precious. Once you start adding observers, it's hard to get rid of them. And it really does affect the flow and the value, the board can provide. And if you stifle conversation, last point on that, what you'll see happening is board members won't talk in the meeting, and they'll just circle back around to the CEO after the meeting and discuss things that should have been discussed during the meeting, which takes away the CEO's time and also prevents you from having a collaborative discussion with all board members on what may be a very important topic. Last thing, because it's on your list, we like if the company has a counsel, an attorney like you, Jeremy, and others that are really experienced with startup companies and can bring some helpful. I think it's great. They understand the business better. They can provide advice on real time sometimes, and generally they do it for free. Sorry, Jeremy, but they use it a way to build that relationship with the client, and there's not a lot of cost associated with it, and they end up in minutes. But if you have I would not just have an attorney there to have an attorney there. I mean, if it's maybe a junior member of the corporate law team at some firm and they're just there to take minutes, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea.
Yeah, John, my experience has been, in the early stage space over my career, and I've done, been in boardrooms, doing it for clients, and it's not, it's not with a meter on. It's to help learn the business. It's to help understand where folks are going. And a lot of times it anticipates problems, or, you can have a 10-second conversation that can, inform everybody and save people from running around for a bit. But I agree. I think, look, to me, it's also important to get the right folks in the room. In my experience, and I've been in, Fortune 100 board meetings down to, in a broom closet. There's not necessarily formalities across the board at a lot of them, but there is a protocol. I think less tends to be better, fewer people if you can, but folks who are going to add value. Let's move a little bit to the what, and we do have a handful of questions, so I'm going to try to keep plowing forward and then maybe hit the pause button and get through some of the questions from the folks who are watching. What happens, and Donna, my thinking is, what happens before the board meeting? You talked about getting a good deck out in enough time, so it's not just flipping the deck. But, do you ever have to have a pre-conversation with folks if there's a sensitive topic, and, what input are you getting, and how do you manage that? And then, John, like your thoughts on that, because my sense is there are discussions that need to happen sometimes, not always, but, that happen around the board meeting, and just trying to get folks advice and experience on that.
Yeah. You don't want any big surprises at your board meeting. That's why the periodic check-ins that I mentioned before make sense. And if there's something that has happened that is materially going to affect your business for the good or for the bad, you need to socialize that before the board meeting, especially with the board chair.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
This is an example where the board chair or lead director, doesn't really matter typically to whoever's going to serve in that role, is so important, because they're the person. I mean, you don't want every board member reaching out to the CEO and having an independent conversation. That board chair organizes that, runs interference, makes sure the CEO is sharing what they should be sharing at the board meeting in terms of the materials, constantly refining the way the board meetings run to make it the most efficient. That's the person, usually the founder, reaches out to say, hey, I got an issue. How do I communicate this to the rest of the board? When should we bring it to people's attention? It's critical to have that person, I think, identified early. And it might be one of the investors, depends on personality largely and skill set, but it may be the independent director. But whoever that person is, identifying them early and having them serve in that role is critical for the kinds of things that Donna and Jeremy, you raise.
So Donna, I'm going to combine a couple of these to try to see if we can, because they're all sort of I'll smush them together because I did that before and confused everyone. But I think these are all at least linear in my mind. So, what does a typical board package look like? What does the agenda look like? You've talked about cadence already, that you do quarterly. Like to get John's view on all these things too. And so, and John, I know you talked about your standard deck, but Donna, from your standpoint, what is a typical agenda? What does a deck look like? And I know you said quarterly on cadence.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share some slides with everyone. I am going to make these slides available after the presentation. So, don't worry about taking copious notes. I can make these available. So this is my typical board agenda. You start with the approval of the board minutes from the previous meeting that you've sent out well in advance. So everybody's had a chance to read them and they're not sitting there for 10 minutes reading over minutes from the prior meeting. And I agree 100% with what John said. You start the board meeting with board members only. That includes the CEO, who's a member of the board. It's the executive session. And as you notice, I have times for each of these things. It helps me if I kind of put some parameters around how long each is going to take so that we have chance to get through everything, right? And so for this first session, we just go through the overall state of the business, my executive dashboard, which are the KPIs that the board and I have agreed are the most important for the company. I do a management team review. If I don't have anything new to say, we pass on that. If we're involved in any kind of M&A activity, we'll talk about that then. And if there are any board resolutions to be passed, this is where we'll handle them. Then next, I bring in my senior team. I never bring middle management into board meetings. I'm talking about my VPs and C-level staff. And the first session after executive is financial. We go through quarterly financial performance versus budget, P&L, balance sheet, cash flow. And then if you have a loan, any kind of performance against those loan covenants is covered. And then if you've got funding initiatives, you talk about your funding initiatives if applicable. Next is administrative, employee headcount, actual to plan, and general administrative overall state of the business. Next, we go into our various department or functional areas, as I call them, those that are focused on acquisition, so sales and marketing, again, state of the business, our CAC efficiency, pipeline, updated sales forecast, and then on the retention side, client services, our retention and churn stats, status of our top clients, implementation state of the business, customer support state of the business, product portfolio, systems, infrastructure state of the business, product development, product roadmap. We always do 1, 3, 5, 10 year. 1 year, obviously more detailed, less detailed as you get out. And then we end with other business. And for other business, senior management can stay, or we ask senior management to be excused depending upon what it is that we have to talk about. So very quickly, I'll get into what that packet looks like. So when I say state of the business, it's simple. It's not writing, tons of materials. It's one slide broken into 4 quadrants. Highlights. So in this past quarter, what are our highlights? What are the remarkable things that we have done, right? Then over to the right is, performance against our key metrics. How did we do? Down to the bottom left, lowlights. What were the things that were not so great that happened to us in the last quarter? And then most important, over in the lower right quadrant, is focus and priorities. So what we tell our board members is, you better read the highlights, the lowlights, the metrics, be really familiar with those, because we're not going to read them to you during the board meeting. But what we really want to talk to you about are our focus and priorities, right? So what's to come? What are our challenges? What are we focused on? Are we, moving in the right direction? That executive dashboard I talked about, these are the things that are important to me. Your business may have different things. Where am I on the rule of 40? What's my cost of acquisition look like? What's my recurring revenue? So every board meeting, exactly the same thing. And we talk about change from the last board meeting. Is it better? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it worse?
Hey, Donna.
Yes.
I'm glad to see, this is very similar to what we see. So one of the things that, CEOs often make the mistake, I think, of preparing a bunch of new materials for the board meeting from a bunch of other stuff, much of what you talked about. And what we would say is, no. This dashboard, you're probably reviewing a version of this with your management team each week. And if not, you should be. Right. So what you need to bring to the board meeting is essentially what you're using internally to run your business at a high level. Those are the summaries you bring in, and then we'll ask questions and there'll be some refinement around the edges. But a lot of the reasons CEOs don't like board meetings is that there's a lot of prep time. I think it's because they go about it the wrong way. And I think with the right chair, lead director, people around that board, you can get it to the point where it's what Donna's presenting. Everything you've said so far is how you're running your business and how you're managing your business internally.
You're exactly right. Every 6 weeks, I have what I call functional meetings with my management team, directors and above. And these are the slides that we use. Yeah, so we're not running around pulling our hair out a week before the board meeting to try to get these things together. Yeah, perfect point. This is the slide for the management team discussion, who the exec is, what their title is. Am I at risk of losing them? Because if I am, that's something that's really important for us to talk about. Well, what about what are they doing well? What are they doing not so well? Have there been successors for this position identified internally? And then is this person a candidate to move on to a next role? And then financial, I'm going to go through these quickly. It's just quarterly and year-to-date financials, bookings, revenue. Sometimes I throw in graphs because it's easier to see and look at pictures, get your mind around how the company's doing by a couple graphics. This is ACV bookings, trends over time, revenue growth, and then, expenses, cost of goods, OPEX, EBITDA, balance sheet, cash flow, loan covenants, administrative, employee headcount versus plan, and then the G&A state of the business. Again, I'll send these out to you so you can see the kinds of things that I think are important to focus on. Days sales outstanding, collections, things like that. And then from a marketing and sales standpoint, and again, you see the slides are all the same and, focused on those 4 quadrants. Couple graphs thrown in, retention slides, implementation state of the business, customer support state of the business, product portfolio, systems, uptime is important in our world, and then product state of the business. And then finally, product roadmap. We like to look at our roadmap in terms of what it's doing for our retention, for our transaction revenue, et cetera, et cetera.
What you've just gone through, that ties very closely to the kind of things we've suggested in our best practices deck. The one thing I would add, and I'm sure, Donna, you do this, don't be afraid to come to the board meeting with some asks of your board in terms of how they can be helpful. It could be on the product roadmap, could be on the sales, could be an introduction to whomever, but don't be shy and be thinking about that in advance of the meeting. So again, as particularly if you have quarterly meetings, make the most of that 2-3 hour time period and hopefully a dinner before or dinner the night of, so you have some time to get to know each other better. But the rest of what Donna went through, I think makes great sense. And then you mentioned, Donna, a quarterly cadence with an update in between, which could be a quick call or email. For startups, seed and startups, we tend to like to start with bi-monthly, just because there's so much they're learning, unless they're serial entrepreneur and they've done this many times before. But pretty quickly, usually in the second year or so, you move to that quarterly cadence with a interim update. Last thing I'll say, and this is super important, I think, recognize, and we started doing this years ago, not all VCs do it, but I think more and more will. We ask for the board decks as part of our due diligence. We go back several years in the materials that are shared. And you want to, just like Jeremy, you referred to the minutes, you got to be very careful about your minutes, and minimal minutes are best, because you never know when there'll be some lawsuit about something and they'll point to some language that nobody thought about and they'll use it against you. So we have very minimal minutes, but the board decks are also important. And there are things you might talk about, including your Series B round and who you like and who you don't like. Have that be in a separate set of materials that are not part of the board deck, and hope when the VCs ask for things, they just ask for the board decks. But be careful about, just assume anything you put in those decks, somebody's going to see them someday, and you want to be mindful of that.
I always assume that whatever minutes I write, my parents will get to read, so I don't want to be embarrassed by anything. That was great, Donna. Thank you. I mean, I think that's so helpful, and John, thanks for the build on that. A couple of things. What I would say is, we see also sort of good. So, if you can get there, a board calendar, and not just a board calendar of, hey, let's figure out when we're going to do this over the next period of next year, but it's a question of, okay, when are we going to talk about D&O insurance? When are we going to talk about cyber or our SOC 2? What are our requirements? And that's not a every meeting thing, but it's a do we have a checklist where we're looking, and so the March meeting is when we decide we're going to do X, Y, and Z. If you have covenant compliance or audit requirements, or other regulatory things that you need to do, can you get that into the cadence? And what we've found is not put that in a long document, but put it in something that's this is the board calendar. This kind of helps us keep track of those things, and not to suggest that they're check the box, but there is a ability to make sure that you just cover them off. Because we have now 13 questions, and it's now 2:30. I'm gonna go to the one that John and I predicted was gonna come, and I'll just try to tick through these until we run out of time, if that's okay. And I'll kick this to whoever wants to take it first, and see where we align. But I think the question is really about compensation to board members. Generally, it's how much equity percentage at a pre-seed stage is normal to offer to a non-investor to join the board. So I'll throw that open to see what, and I think it's probably a broader discussion around what else would you do for board members.
Yeah, in terms of compensation for board members, I've always used options. And I've always reimbursed travel expenses for those folks that are outside the area. But I'll go ahead and throw it to John to talk about maybe some guidance on how many options.
Sure, and yes, if somebody asks for cash, you don't want them as a board member. If compensation becomes too difficult a challenge, you probably don't want them as a board member. Those are kind of red flags, at least for us. At the seed startup early stage, it's just like our business of how we value companies. It's an art. It's not a science. I mean, when you get to be a mature PE back, the math is easier. So roughly speaking, and I've checked this on several occasions, and everybody says, yep, that's about how we do it. For a board member, for a very good board member, in the Midwest, West Coast board members have higher expectations sometimes. You're trying to give them an option package that when the company exit based on whatever is your base case set of assumptions, not this, shoot the moon, but not a mediocre outcome, they're going to see somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000 of value. And it's hard to do because you've got to say, okay, you might say your company is going to be worth $1 billion. And by the way, if you can convince the board member that that's the case, you're going to give them a whole lot less options. But typically, you're probably going to look and say, all right, you might exit between 150, 200 million, 250 million, whatever it is, wombat-like exit. And I need to see that I can get to that $250,000 to $500,000 range. And I might make a lot less. I might make more. There may be a windfall, but if there is, we're all going to be happy. And typically the vesting, I mean, the pricing on it, the exercise price is tied to whatever your 409A valuation is, even though they're non-qualified options. And typically there's probably a 3-year vest. And typically if you've got a really strong board member, when you have a subsequent round dilution, you're probably going to re-up that board member at least partially to offset some of that dilution. But that's the way we do it. And like I said, if you really get into some, most board members are going to join your board. Most board members that you would want have already probably made it to some degree. So they're really looking for compensation, at least makes them feel valued, but it's not how they're going to get rich. And so if you find somebody that seems like a good board member and they're really getting into the finer details of how they can make $1 million or whatever, yeah, again, I'd at least have that be a pink flag, if not a red flag.
Yeah, I think if the first question your prospective board member asks is how much D&O do you have and who's your carrier, that's a much better indication versus, what's my cash compensation going to be? But I think that's the range. I mean, I think, the range of what you all are talking about in equity equity definitely is the, from the vantage point of how we see the vast majority of directors compensated. We do see expense reimbursement. I mean, being sort of middle of America, it's sort of normal expense reimbursement. It's not anything crazy. Most folks who are on a early stage board, particularly if they've been an entrepreneur, they've been in the space, they understand, sort of what, the right way to approach those expense reimbursements. So we generally see that be not a huge issue. Another, I guess this question, not sure. Interesting. I'll kick it out. I'll kick it to whoever wants to answer first. What indicates good or bad board performance?
Do they? I mean, Donna talked about this. We've talked about it a little bit. Well, this is at a macro level. Are they engaged? Do they read the materials in advance?
Yep.
Do they want to understand your business? Donna, I loved your discussion of how you onboard them. I mean, I've the public board I'm on, they didn't onboard people very well, and you had board members sitting around didn't really understand the business and didn't have enough. So you want a board member that you as the CEO get a sense they're really interested in your business and they can bring value. And if those two ingredients are there, chances are they're going to understand your business. They're going to find ways to be helpful, and whether that's with introductions or guidance or whatever. But that's the having them be engaged and not being intrusive in terms of how they maybe interact with you in between meetings, and not be grandstanders. I mean, we've seen plenty that want to talk and want to be heard at the meeting and want to go off on tangents. And again, that's where your director or your chairman or lead director can shut that down in a nice way, and sometimes can help those folks find a different board to serve on, or at least get them off your board. But it's not that complicated.
Yeah, I love the board member who in a board meeting, when you're talking about one of your challenges, grabs a marker and stands up the whiteboard and said, "Did you ever think of looking at it this way?" That's the kind of board member you want.
Yeah. And by the way, one last thing on it, Jeremy, I forgot about this earlier. This is a warning sign for us as investors, but it should be a warning sign for the CEO. If the board is, the board is there as a sound governance, put governance aside, they are there to react to the recommendations of the CEO and management team, whether it's on strategy, on dealing with a difficult issue, or hire, whatever it is. That CEO needs to come in and say, here's what, thought about it, here's what we need to do. And then you have the board react to it. If the board is, if the CEO comes in and says, what do you think we ought to do? And the board is engaging in that leadership role, you got a bad situation. And if you have a board that tries to engage in that leadership role, you have a bad situation, and you need to think about how you're going to, reconstruct how that board functions. So watch for that.
Yeah, I think, all great points. I think value, right? I mean, is somebody coming in and adding value to management? John, to your point, do they also view it the right way? I mean, sometimes you see particularly some angel investors who they're not answering the question as a director, they're answering the question as an investor. And, that those hats are very sometimes different. And as much as you might not like something as an investor, when you're in the boardroom, you need to disassociate yourself from that the same way that management needs to kind of look at the lens of their duty. And Donna, to your point, I mean, it's really the folks who are, they're excited to be there. They're trying to solve problems. They're rolling up their sleeves. And also, in this type of company, and they're foxhole people, right? I mean, it's when things get hard, and they do get hard, even in the most successful companies, you want them to, be thinking, in a very abundant way, not a way to run away from it. So, all good things. This one, maybe we can hit this one quickly, but it's, the question is, what about term limits? John, as a reformed lawyer who still admits it, I'll kick it to you.
Never seen it. I mean, they just, I wouldn't waste any time talking about it. Have a strong chair or lead director. He or she becomes your term limit function. But trying to set it up, because you might say term limits, and then you don't want the board member to leave because they're wonderful. So I've never seen, and I don't think I've even seen that tried at a for-profit startup early stage company.
Don, I don't know if you want to weigh in there at all.
All I have to say is I've never ever used term limits.
Yeah. I think if you're getting into that level of nitty gritty, you've got other issues. I mean, I think hopefully you've got real business problems to solve, not sort of architectural of how can we roll folks off. And that's not to say that question doesn't have significance. It's just, I think the idea is sometimes you can focus too much on the uniqueness of the governance and not get to the substance of why folks are there. And
real quick, you wouldn't want to wait for the end of the term to have that person roll off and use it for that function. If you have a bad board member, just like if you have an employee that's not, making it, you need to make those decisions promptly and make a change. And I know it's easy to say, but you got to set a structure that allows that to happen, because it's, time is precious for young companies. And so, yeah, no term limits.
Great. And then there was the question, John, and Donna, you said you'd do this. So folks have asked if John, you could share the deck, and obviously Donna, so I'll ask Jordan and Ian from the PVCA team if they can coordinate that and make sure we get that out to folks. Then the next one, I'll try to synthesize it a little bit. I think the genesis is, what are thoughts on engaging someone as an advisor versus a board member? And it assumes that there's still long-term value in having the advisor. It's their knowledge and skill sets. What do these non-board members bring to the table? Are they still engaged? Expectations around compensation, and are you offering a number of folks these types of arrangements? I'll Donna, I know you've. Why don't I kick that to you and see if you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, in the early stages of my various companies, I've always had advisors in addition to, but very separate from my board of directors. And they were advisors in very specific areas that the company needed help with. And I compensated them with stock options.
Great.
Yeah. Oftentimes founders need a coach, and that's not necessarily a board member. Sometimes the coaching comes from a board member. We talked about the type of people you add to your board in the early stages. You might find somebody who brings industry experience, but also brings experience of building a company several times from the startup stage. And that person ends up being a mentor and a coach to the founder. But if you don't have that in your board, yeah, go find somebody. And if you have to compensate them because they're adding real value through options, please, Donna said, do it. Yeah.
I'll give a small plug and not as an advertisement, but Billy Campbell, there's a great book, The $1 Billion Coach. Billy Campbell was from Pittsburgh. started his career as a football coach at Columbia, and ended up going to Kodak, and then really being the architect of a lot of Apple's advertising. And for years was sort of the CEO whisperer in the Valley, and I once had the pleasure of introducing him to speak. He was quite a character. Came from Homestead, and would go to his local bar in Homestead every time he came back with all his old friends. A lot of Pittsburgh there, but it's a really good book about sort of the coaching element around sort of CEOs, and but both of you know this, and I sort of know it from the role we play, but the CEO role can be a very lonely one, and it can be very difficult, and having someone that you can confide in who maybe doesn't have fiduciary duties but can help is good, and I think the CEOs that I think are the most successful, he or she realizes that they don't know everything, and they're looking out to try to get some expertise. I'll try to, we're running a little bit out of time, so maybe I'll skip and see if there's any other questions that I can get quickly. Let's see. How does the content of the typical business canvas, or what parts of it connect to the typical board meeting? I think, Donna, you kind of overlaid this, which I think, if I understand the question correctly, it's what are the components that you're reporting on? And I think, generally speaking, it's the components that you report out with your team all the time. Is that not right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's the KPIs that you look at every day to assess your business, and it's an overview of the key areas of the company. If you're a software company, it's your product development, your systems. No matter what the company, it's sales and marketing, right? That's always a key component, and then the operations piece.
Great,
Jeremy. I thought just one quick thing. We talked about who's in the meeting, and I agree. Senior folks, in addition to CEO, are in the meeting. Some CEOs don't like that. They like to basically be there most of the meeting, and maybe have cameos for some other folks. And you want to let your senior team interact with the board. That could be a dinner the night before, but certainly in the meeting. Two reasons. One, they get to know. They can pick up things by watching how those folks present or talk or whatever, and provide you with some strong feedback that they won't have the opportunity to do if they don't get to know your senior team. So not middle managers, but VP and above, making sure your board interacts with those folks, I think, is important.
I think that social engagement is really a great idea between board members and the senior management team. So again, I know we can't do it today, but eventually we will be having dinner with each other again. So dinner the night before, dinner the night after, even breakfast before the meeting, just a chance for people to talk and to get to know each other.
Yeah.
Great. And I couldn't agree more. I think those informal social engagements in a non-COVID world, I think it's been very difficult in a COVID environment to get those. You take a break in a board meeting, and you have the ability to, go get coffee with somebody, and that conversation can lead to another conversation. I think the informal things around boards, again, it's a bit of its own, subculture. I think those are extraordinarily important, and it's been quite remarkable in the current environment how we've been able to kind of both boards, large and small, have been able to get through it. I've obviously, because we were a little late, we pushed this 1 minute over. First, I really want to say thank you to Donna and John. I think, hopefully as the director of traffic here, I did well enough, but the content that you all provided was spectacular. I think the folks who are listening in, the stuff that you've talked about is embodies a number of years of learnings, and really, I think if you look at those things, folks can take a lot away. So really appreciate those insights and a lot of good practical advice. I'd be remiss if I didn't say to Ian and Jordan, and Micah and Kelly, and the rest of the team at the PVCA, thank you for putting this on, and the Three River Venture Fair. Look out for the virtual fair, lastly, there will be a survey that comes out, an online survey, and if you could fill that out, that's always terrific for us to get the feedback. So Donna and John, thank you very much. This is the last session, and I really think it was great content and really helping the folks who have listened in. Really appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Great.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jeremy. Good to work with you, Donna. Thanks.